June 4th, 1942. 10:24 a.m., 240 nautical miles northwest of Midway Atoll. From 14,000 feet above the Pacific, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky stared down through the canopy of his SBD Dauntless dive bomber and saw a sight no one had expected. Far below, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers steamed in flawless diamond formation across a calm blue sea. On their flight decks, dozens of aircraft stood fully armed and fueled, lined up wingtip to wingtip. Fuel hoses snaked across wooden planking, bombs sat ready on loading carts, and crews rushed to prepare the next strike. The enemy was exposed, utterly vulnerable. For McClusky and the 32 dive bombers that followed him, it was a moment born of chance, instinct, and determination. They had been searching empty ocean for 2 hours, their fuel gauges nearly dry and morale fading fast. The Japanese fleet was not where intelligence had predicted it would be. Their carefully coordinated attack plan had unravelled. Torpedo Squadron 8, 15 aircraft from the carrier Hornet, had already been wiped out in a suicidal charge against the enemy. Not one plane returned. Only 1 man survived. For most commanders, that would have been the end. Time to turn back, save what little remained of their fuel, and live to fight another day. But McClusky refused. Half an hour earlier, he had spotted something, a single Japanese destroyer racing northeast at full speed, leaving a long white wake across the water. The ship was the Arashi, returning to the fleet after depth charging an American submarine, the USS Nautilus. McClusky made a split-second decision that would alter the course of the Pacific War. He would follow that destroyer. Now his gamble had paid off. Below him lay the heart of Japan's carrier force, the Kaga, Akagi, Soryu and Hiryu, the same fleet that had devastated Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. And at that exact moment, they were preparing to launch another strike, unaware that American bombers were already overhead. The Japanese had no radar. Their combat air patrol, Elite Zero fighters, were far below, chasing the last American torpedo bombers that had attacked minutes before. The sky above the fleet was unguarded. McClusky rolled his Dauntless into a dive and gave the order that would be etched into history. Attack! At 10:24 a.m., 32 dive bombers from the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown tilted their noses toward the sea and plunged. Admiral Chester Nimitz would later describe the next 5 minutes as the moment that decided the Pacific War. But to understand its impact, one must understand what Japan had become in the 6 months since Pearl Harbor. By mid-1942, the Japanese Empire appeared unstoppable. Since December 7th, 1941, it had swept across Asia and the Pacific, conquering territory larger than all of Europe. Hong Kong had fallen in 18 days, Manila in 26, Singapore, once called the Gibraltar of the East, India just 70. Japan's military had driven the British from Malaya, the Dutch from the East Indies, and the Americans from the Philippines. Its carrier fleet, the Kido Butai, had never known defeat. It had sunk 5 battleships at Pearl Harbor, destroyed the British carrier Hermes in the Indian Ocean, and forced the Royal Navy to retreat from Asian waters. Its pilots were the most experienced combat aviators on Earth, hardened by years of war in China. Their Mitsubishi Zero fighters outperformed every Allied aircraft they faced. Their dive bombers and torpedo planes struck with precision and fury. The Japanese war machine believed in its invincibility. It believed in Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, the conviction that courage, discipline, and sacrifice could overcome any disadvantage in numbers or technology. And it was that belief that carried them toward Midway, the operation designed to destroy the last of America's carrier force and end the war in the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had designed an operation as elaborate as it was daring. A feint toward the Aleutian Islands in the north would lure part of the American fleet away. Meanwhile, the main Japanese strike force, 4 carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, and 46 destroyers would converge on Midway itself, draw out the remaining American carriers, and annihilate them in one decisive battle. In all, over 200 Japanese warships took part, the largest concentration of naval power the world had ever seen. The core of that armada were the 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carrying 248 aircraft, manned by the best-trained naval aviators in existence. The odds were crushing. America could muster only 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered Yorktown, hastily patched together in just 72 hours after being damaged at Coral Sea. But the Americans possessed something Japan did not: intelligence. At Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, a team of cryptanalysts led by Commander Joseph Rochefort had cracked the Japanese naval code. They knew Japan's next target was Midway. They knew the date, June 4th. They even knew the composition of the enemy fleet and its approach route. Armed with this knowledge, Admiral Nimitz set a trap of his own, positioning his carriers northeast of Midway, hidden and waiting, but even the best intelligence could not guarantee victory. At dawn on June 4th, the first American attacks began, and went terribly wrong. Fighter squadrons from Midway were shredded by Zero interceptors. Army B-17 bombers, attacking from high altitude, missed every target. Marine dive bombers pressed in bravely, only to be shot down in flames. Torpedo bombers, obsolete TBD devastators flying at barely 100 knots, made one attack after another, unsupported by fighters, uncoordinated and hopelessly outmatched. 15 aircraft from Hornets. Torpedo Squadron 8 went in, and 15 were destroyed. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating for hours in the Pacific watching the battle unfold around him. Of 41 torpedo bombers launched that morning, only 6 returned. Not a single torpedo struck home. From the bridges of the Japanese carriers, officers like Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, watched the destruction with cold admiration. The American pilots were brave, he thought, but reckless. Their sacrifice to him seemed meaningless. He was wrong. Those failed torpedo attacks had achieved something extraordinary, something no one realized at the time. They had dragged every Japanese fighter in the sky down to sea level. The Zero pilots, defending their fleet from wave after wave of low-flying torpedo planes, had emptied the skies above. Their fuel and ammunition were nearly gone, their attention fixed entirely on the ocean's surface. When McClusky's dauntless bombers arrived minutes later, unseen, unheard, there was no one left to stop them. At 10:20 a.m., aboard the carrier Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo finally received word that American carriers had been sighted. He ordered his own strike force prepared for launch. On the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, nearly 90 bombers and torpedo planes stood ready, fully fueled and armed. Engines roared to life as deck crews scrambled to clear the way. The carriers began turning into the wind for takeoff. They would need only 5 more minutes, but time had run out. At 10:24 a.m., the first dauntless dive bombers appeared out of the sun. They fell almost vertically, shrieking through the sky at over 260 miles per hour, releasing their bombs from just 2,500 feet. Each bomb, a 500-pound armor-piercing explosive with a delayed fuse, was designed to punch through a ship's deck before detonating inside. The Japanese had no chance to react. Their anti-aircraft guns could not elevate fast enough to track the diving bombers. The Zero fighters were miles below, and the carriers mid-turn could not maneuver. At 10:25, the first bomb hit Kaga. It struck near the island superstructure, piercing through the wooden deck and igniting rows of fully fueled aircraft. A second bomb exploded near the forward elevator, setting off secondary explosions. A third struck aft, detonating beneath the flight deck. Within seconds, Kaga was engulfed in flame, a floating inferno. Moments later, Lieutenant Richard Best and his section peeled off toward Akagi. The other bombers had mistakenly followed McClusky onto Kaga, leaving Akagi almost untouched. Best aimed carefully and released a single bomb. It struck dead center. The explosion tore through the hangar deck, detonating torpedoes and bombs stacked below. Flames roared upward, consuming the bridge. Commander Fuchida, standing on Akagi's deck, watched helplessly as his ship erupted in fire. In less than 5 minutes, 2 of Japan's 4 carriers were doomed. Soryu and Hiryu would soon follow. The Japanese Navy, undefeated for decades, had been shattered in a single morning, and the war in the Pacific would never be the same again. The explosion lifted Commander Mitsuo Fuchida from his feet. A roar of fire and steel erupted through Akagi's hangar deck, followed by the thunder of secondary detonations. Within moments, a wall of smoke and flame rolled through the carrier's midsection. Fuchida staggered to the bridge window just in time to see a sight almost beyond belief. Across the horizon, 2 more carriers, Kaga and Soryu, were burning. Pillars of black smoke climbed thousands of feet into the sky. 3 carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, the core of its power, were engulfed in flames simultaneously. Fuchida would later describe the scene in words filled with disbelief. It was a sight too terrible to behold. The 3rd carrier, Soryu, had been found by dive bombers from the Yorktown. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie led 17 Dauntless aircraft in a flawless, almost textbook attack. 3 bombs struck in rapid succession, 1 forward, 1 amidships, 1 aft. The first explosion ripped through the forward elevator, igniting aviation fuel. The second detonated in the hangar deck, scattering burning fragments among rows of fully armed aircraft. The third tore through the stern, blowing men and debris into the sea. Within 5 minutes, Soryu was a floating inferno. Her crew fought the flames with everything they had, but the heat was overwhelming. Many jumped overboard to escape the blaze. By 10:30 a.m., all 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were mortally wounded. The scale of the destruction defied comprehension. The Akagi, the pride of Japan's fleet, flagship of the carrier striking force, was burning out of control. Kaga, veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, was breaking apart amid massive explosions. Soryu, the smallest and fastest of the fleet carriers, was gone. More than 240 aircraft, many fueled and armed for takeoff, were consumed by fire. Over 700 of Japan's most highly trained pilots, mechanics, and deck crew were dead or dying. The numbers told only part of the story. Those 3 ships represented 2/3 of Japan's carrier strength. They had participated in every major operation since the war began. Akagi displaced 36,000 tons and could carry 91 aircraft. Kaga carried 90, Soryu carried 71. Together they formed the backbone of Japan's naval air arm, and in a single morning that backbone had been broken. Japan had spent years creating this elite force. Its pilots were not merely soldiers, they were craftsmen of aerial warfare. Each had endured grueling years-long training programs. They could hit moving ships from 12,000 feet, launch torpedoes within yards of their targets, and execute precision landings on pitching decks. They were veterans of the China War, of Pearl Harbor, of the Philippines, of the Dutch East Indies, an elite whose experience could not be replicated overnight. Now, that experience was burning. This was not just the loss of ships or machines. It was the loss of institutional memory, of hard-won combat skill, evaporating in black smoke over the Pacific. And the timing of the disaster made it even worse. Had the American bombers arrived 10 minutes earlier, the Japanese planes would still have been below decks, somewhat shielded by steel bulkheads. Had they come 10 minutes later, most of those planes would have been airborne, leaving the decks relatively clear. But fate and McClusky's instinct had brought the attack at the exact worst moment. Every carrier's flight deck was crowded with fueled aircraft, bombs and torpedoes, a chain of explosions waiting to happen. The Japanese carriers had become their own powder magazines. On Akagi's bridge, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo tried to remain in command, even as the ship shook under repeated detonations. Smoke poured through shattered hatches. The bridge grew hot, the air thick and choking. By 10:46 a.m., it was clear the ship was lost. Nagumo gave the order to abandon her. He climbed down a rope to the deck below, the flames almost at his back. His staff followed, transferring to the light cruiser Nagara. From there, he could only watch as the flagship of his once invincible strike force burned beyond saving. On Akagi, Captain Taijiro Aoki refused to leave his post. He directed damage control teams as explosions rocked the ship. Fuel lines ruptured. Bombs detonated in the hangars. Men trapped below decks perished in the fire or leapt into the sea. Fuchida, still injured from an earlier appendectomy, stood helplessly on the deck as his ship, the same one that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, disintegrated before his eyes. 267 men would die aboard Akagi. Kaga's fate was no less grim. Multiple bomb hits had set off a chain reaction that the crew could not contain. The carrier's fire suppression systems, built to handle a single detonation, were overwhelmed by several simultaneous explosions. Power failed. Communication lines were cut. Water mains ruptured. Sailors fought the fires with buckets, without coordination or hope. By early afternoon, the order was given to abandon ship. 81 men were lost. Soryu died fastest of all. Her captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, refused to leave his command. His officers pleaded with him to abandon ship, but he would not. He stood on the bridge as flames engulfed the ship. At 7:13 p.m., Soryu rolled over and sank beneath the Pacific, taking Captain Yanagimoto and 71 crewmen with her. Only one Japanese carrier remained operational, Hiryu. She had been several miles north during the American attack and escaped the initial devastation. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding Hiryu, immediately prepared a counterstrike. At 10:50 a.m., while the other 3 carriers burned, Hiryu launched 18 dive bombers, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. 2 hours later, they found the Yorktown. 3 bombs struck home, 1 forward, 1 near the island, 1 aft. The explosions knocked out her boilers and started major fires. But Hiryu wasn't finished. At 2:30 p.m., she launched a second strike. 18 torpedo bombers, again escorted by Zeros. At 2:45 they struck Yorktown again. 2 torpedoes slammed into her hull, crippling the ship. She began to list badly. At 3 p.m., Captain Elliot Buckmaster gave the order: abandon ship. The Yorktown, patched together in just 72 hours for this battle, now lay dead in the water, but her sacrifice had already ensured victory. Revenge came swiftly. At 5 p.m., scout planes from Yorktown located Hiryu. Moments later, 24 dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise appeared overhead. They attacked in waves. 4 bombs struck Hiryu, 2 near the forward elevator, 2 amidships. Explosions tore through the hangar deck, igniting aviation fuel and ordnance. Within minutes, Hiryu was ablaze from bow to stern. By 6:30 p.m., her flight deck was a twisted landscape of burning metal. Admiral Yamaguchi refused to abandon his ship. He stood beside Captain Tomeo Kaku as the fires closed in. Both men chose to die aboard their flagship rather than face the dishonor of survival after defeat. At 2:30 a.m. on June 5th, Hiryu was scuttled by Japanese destroyers. She sank with Yamaguchi, Kaku, and nearly 400 of her crew. By dawn, the scale of the catastrophe was clear. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, all veterans of Pearl Harbor, were gone. With them, 248 aircraft and approximately 3,000 men. It was the single most devastating defeat in Japanese naval history. The strike force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months had ceased to exist in a single day. For the Japanese Navy, the psychological impact was immense. Officers who had believed utterly in their invincibility, in their superior training, discipline, and spirit, were forced to confront a shattering truth. The myth of their invulnerability had died at Midway. Aboard the destroyer that rescued him from the burning Akagi, Commander Fuchida lay with both ankles broken, staring across the dark sea. He understood what others could not yet admit. Japan had not merely lost a battle, it had lost the war. Its edge in carrier aviation, the very weapon that had brought victory across the Pacific, was gone. Its pilots, the product of years of training, could not be replaced. Its shipyards, already stretched, could never rebuild 4 fleet carriers fast enough to catch up. By contrast, America's industrial engine was only beginning to awaken. The US had lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, and 307 men. Japan had lost 4 carriers, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 of its finest. The United States could replace Yorktown in months. Japan could not replace Akagi in years. By the end of 1942, 2 new American carriers, Essex and Independence, would join the fleet. By the end of 1943, 13 more. By war's end, the United States Navy would command over 100 carriers of all sizes. Japan's shipyards could build perhaps 1 a year. The empire that had seemed unstoppable in December 1941 was now trapped in slow collapse, undone by 5 minutes of fire above a quiet blue sea. After the Battle of Midway, the Imperial Japanese Navy was left reeling. Barely 1,000 carrier pilots remained, many of them exhausted veterans of earlier campaigns. The once proud training program that had taken years to mold elite aviators could no longer replenish the losses. By 1944, Japan's carrier decks were filled not with seasoned warriors, but with young, inexperienced men, rushed through abbreviated flight schools and sent into combat against Americans flying faster, deadlier aircraft with hundreds of hours of training behind them. Far to the north, aboard the massive battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the reports with disbelief. The operation he had personally designed, the grand trap that was supposed to annihilate America's carrier fleet, had turned into catastrophe. Over 100 Japanese warships had steamed toward Midway Island, the most formidable fleet Japan had ever assembled. Now, its striking arm was gone. In the early hours of June 5, 1942, at 2:55 a.m., Yamamoto issued the grim order: all forces were to withdraw. The invasion of Midway was cancelled. The retreat was humiliating. The landing force that had trained for weeks never came within sight of the island. Battleships prepared to shell Midway never fired a single round. Submarines sent to trap fleeing American carriers were out of position. The elaborate plan, built on deception and timing, had unravelled completely. Even Japan's diversionary operation in the Aleutians, a feint meant to draw American attention north, achieved nothing of consequence. The Japanese occupied 2 barren, fog-covered islands that would be abandoned a year later. As the Japanese fleet limped home, American dive bombers continued the pursuit. On June 6th, aircraft from Enterprise and Hornet found the heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, which had collided in the chaos of retreat. Slowed and vulnerable, Mikuma was struck by 5 bombs in quick succession. Her fuel tanks erupted, and by afternoon she slipped beneath the waves. Mogami was badly damaged and would spend over a year in repair docks. With Mikuma gone, the Battle of Midway officially ended. But its consequences would echo for the rest of the war. Midway marked the turning point. From that day onward, Japan would never again hold the strategic initiative. The conquest that had spread across the Pacific would halt. The US Navy, battered but unbroken, would dictate the tempo of the war. 2 months later, in August 1942, American Marines landed on Guadalcanal. The campaign that followed lasted 6 brutal months and further drained Japan's remaining strength. Carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku fought in the battles around the Solomon Islands, but by the campaign's end their air groups were shattered. Hundreds of Japan's best pilots were gone, replaced by green recruits who lacked both skill and confidence. By mid-1943, Japanese carrier aviation existed largely in name. The squadrons were skeletons, planes without fuel, pilots without experience, decks without dominance. A year later, in June 1944, Japan's air arm faced its final reckoning in the skies over the Philippine Sea. As waves of Japanese aircraft attacked the US fleet, American pilots and gunners cut them down with devastating efficiency. The slaughter became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 300 Japanese planes fell in a single day. The losses were staggering, not just in machines, but in the last remnants of Japan's trained aviators. By the time of the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the Japanese carrier force was a ghost fleet. The great ships Zuikaku, Chitose, and Chiyoda sailed north with almost no aircraft aboard. They were meant only as bait, a decoy to lure Admiral William Bull Halsey's task force away, while Japanese battleships attacked American landing beaches in the Philippines. Halsey took the bait. But the Japanese plan failed anyway. American escort carriers, destroyers, and relentless pilots stopped the battleships cold. The decoy carriers were caught and sunk by airstrikes. None had launched more than a handful of planes. From Midway onward, the road to Japan's defeat was inevitable. Without control of the skies, the empire could not defend its vast holdings. Without territory, Japan lost access to vital oil, rubber, and metals. Without resources, its industries slowed, then faltered, and without production, its navy and air force withered. The spiral was irreversible. Historians would later trace that downward spiral to one decision made on June 4, 1942, when Lieutenant Commander Clarence McClusky chose to keep searching despite low fuel, spotted the lone destroyer Arashi, and followed its wake straight to the Japanese carrier group. That choice, and the 5 minutes of devastation that followed, changed the course of history. Admiral Chester Nimitz would later write that McClusky's judgment decided the fate of the carrier task force and of Midway itself. Had the dauntless dive bombers arrived 10 minutes earlier or later, the outcome might have been very different. Among the Japanese survivors, there was little doubt. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor but lay wounded during Midway, later wrote that the battle doomed Japan. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who commanded the carrier strike force, was quietly reassigned and never again held an important command. During the Battle of Saipan in 1944, cornered and facing defeat, he took his own life. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, who went down with his ship Hiryu, was mourned as one of the Navy's most brilliant minds. His death another wound Japan could not afford. For the Americans, victory came at terrible cost. Torpedo Squadron 8 was wiped out. 15 planes launched, 1 man returned, Ensign George Gay, who spent hours adrift in the ocean, watching the burning wrecks of Japanese carriers. From Enterprise, Torpedo Squadron 6 lost 10 of 14 aircraft. From Yorktown, Torpedo Squadron 3 lost 10 of 12. Even the victorious dive bomber squadrons suffered grievous losses. Of 115 American planes that attacked, nearly half were destroyed. The survivors limped back to their carriers low on fuel and riddled with bullet holes. McClusky himself, wounded by enemy fire, landed on Enterprise with less than 5 gallons of fuel remaining. Others ditched into the sea, never to be seen again. But they knew what they had achieved. In 5 minutes of fury, they had broken the spine of the Imperial Navy's striking power. The alignment of luck, courage, and timing was almost supernatural. McClusky's persistence, the torpedo crew's sacrifice, and the Japanese fleet's vulnerability all converged at that single moment. The Japanese carriers were turning into the wind to launch planes just as the dive bombers arrived overhead. Their decks were crowded with fueled aircraft and armed ordnance, a floating magazine waiting to explode. But the luck was earned. It was the result of cryptographers who had cracked the Japanese naval code, of Admiral Nimitz who trusted their intelligence, and of sailors and airmen who fought with every ounce of determination. War correspondent Robert Sherrod would later call Midway the most decisive battle of the Pacific War, more critical than Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, or Okinawa. He was right. After June 4, 1942, the question of who controlled the Pacific was answered. The United States would advance, island by island, until the war ended in Tokyo Bay. The consequences of those 5 minutes rippled far beyond the atoll itself. By mid-1945, Japan's military planners faced a grim reality. Their fleets lay at the bottom of the Pacific, their skies were dominated by American aircraft, and their factories could no longer sustain the war. Even with desperate kamikaze attacks, pilots sent to die by crashing into American ships, the end was certain. These suicide missions, born of hopelessness, were the final proof of Japan's collapse in naval aviation. The veteran pilots who might have led them to victory had died at Midway, in the Solomons, and over the Philippine Sea. Their replacements, barely trained, were sent to die. Admiral Yamamoto never recovered from the defeat. His spirit, once confident and calculating, became somber. In April 1943, American intelligence intercepted his travel plans. Acting on the decrypted message, P-38 Lightning fighters ambushed and shot down his transport over Bougainville. The architect of Pearl Harbor and Midway perished in flames, a victim of the same intelligence network that had sealed his fate a year earlier. Midway had revealed the hard truth of modern war. Courage and skill are vital, but industry and intelligence decide the outcome. The nation that can rebuild faster, adapt quicker, and see the enemy's plans before they unfold will always prevail. Japan had entered the war convinced that discipline and spirit could overcome America's industrial might. Midway shattered that illusion. It proved that the future belonged to those who could fuse bravery with technology and insight with production. And for Japan, that truth came too late, burning brightly in the 5 minutes that changed the Pacific forever. When the torpedo squadrons went in at Midway, they knew their chances were close to zero. Their slow, underarmed planes made them easy prey for the elite Japanese fighters circling above. One by one, they fell into the Pacific, their burning aircraft vanishing into smoke and spray. Yet their sacrifice, though seemingly wasted, accomplished something vital. By forcing the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, they cleared the skies for the American dive bombers still searching above the clouds. It was a system built on coordination, a fragile network of timing, courage, and endurance, and it worked. Even when entire squadrons were wiped out, the machine kept turning. The American approach, guided by flexibility and trust in individual judgment, proved resilient. The Japanese, for all their skill and training, had no such margin for error. When chaos struck their carriers, their system collapsed. Fire, confusion, and failure rippled across the decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Fuel lines, exposed and unshielded, turned into fire hoses of burning aviation gasoline. Bombs and torpedoes stacked in hangars without protection ignited in chain reactions that ripped the ships apart. Japan's carriers had been designed to strike hard, not to endure. Their offensive power was unmatched until the moment they were hit. Then, with no redundancy and no depth in command, the entire structure fell apart. When Admiral Nagumo's flagship was struck, communications broke down instantly. Orders went unanswered. Pilots circling overhead had no direction. Fires roared unchecked through open hangar bays. Men who had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor only months earlier were now trapped aboard ships that had become infernos. Even at the highest levels, the same flaws repeated. Admiral Yamamoto's plan for the Midway operation had been a masterpiece of complexity. Fleets scattered across thousands of miles, multiple diversions, a feint toward Alaska meant to split American attention. But complexity is fragile. Once American intelligence broke Japan's naval codes, Yamamoto's precision became his weakness. His divided forces could no longer support each other. By contrast, Admiral Chester Nimitz kept his plan brutally simple. He hid his carriers northeast of Midway and waited. When the Japanese attacked, He struck back with everything he had, disjointed, imperfect, but decisive. It was a gamble that favored adaptability over perfection, and it paid off. In those few minutes of chaos, American dive bombers achieved what months of planning had not: the destruction of Japan's carrier strike force. Simplicity, executed with courage, triumphed over complexity that demanded flawless timing. That principle would shape naval warfare for the rest of the century. The Battle of Midway marked the birth of a new era, the age of the aircraft carrier. Battleships, once symbols of sea power, were finished. No amount of armor could protect a vessel from bombs dropped miles away. From this point onward, naval dominance would belong to whoever could project air power the farthest and replace it the fastest. America understood that truth. By the end of the war, the United States had built more than 100 aircraft carriers. Japan managed barely 24. That imbalance alone determined the fate of the Pacific. The pilots who fought at Midway could not have known any of this. Lieutenant Commander Clarence McClusky, flying a plane shredded by bullets, was just trying to get home. Lieutenant Richard Best, gasping from oxygen failure after his dive, could barely hold the controls. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, leading Yorktown's bombers, worried about the men he'd lost. None of them thought about history. They thought about surviving another minute. Yet historians would later recognize that these men, in 5 minutes of combat, had achieved what entire armies sometimes could not. They had broken the back of Japanese naval power. For Japan, Midway was the end of the beginning. For America, it was the beginning of the end. Admiral Nimitz would later write that without the victory at Midway, the Pacific War might have dragged on 3 more years. 3 more years of blood and loss. The Japanese aviators who died aboard their burning carriers were among the finest in the world. Their skill and discipline were unmatched, but even mastery cannot overcome overwhelming odds. On June 4th, 1942, they were caught unprepared. Their decks crowded with refueling planes, their bomb bays open, their fighters low on fuel. In those few minutes, all their training, all their experience became irrelevant. Commander Mitsuo Fushida, one of the few Japanese officers to survive, later wrote the definitive Japanese account of the battle. In his book Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, published in 1955, he admitted what many in Japan already knew, that the Americans had achieved total surprise and that Midway had sealed Japan's fate. He credited US intelligence, leadership, and the courage of pilots who pressed their attacks through impossible defenses. Those 5 minutes between 10:24 and 10:29 a.m. changed the course of the Pacific War. 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were fatally hit. The 4th, Hiryu, would be sunk by evening. The fleet that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months was wiped out in a single day. McClusky limped back to the Enterprise with over 50 holes in his plane, a wound in his shoulder, and barely enough fuel to land. He never called himself a hero. "I was just doing my job," he later said. That humility reflected the attitude of so many who fought at Midway. They mourned their friends, repaired their planes, and prepared for the next mission. But deep down, they understood. Midway had changed everything. The battle proved that wars aren't won by sheer bravery or even brilliant tactics. They're won by the accumulation of advantages: industrial strength, intelligence gathering, logistics, and training. Japan entered the war believing superior fighting spirit could compensate for limited resources. Midway proved otherwise. The United States had everything Japan lacked: radar-guided coordination, a code-breaking advantage, factories that could outproduce any loss, and a willingness to adapt under pressure. In the end, those factors outweighed courage alone. From that day forward, Japan was on the defensive. The empire that had expanded across the Pacific in 6 months would spend the next 3 years losing it all. island by island, ship by ship, pilot by pilot, until nothing remained but the ruins of its ambitions. The flames that consumed Japan's carriers at Midway were more than physical destruction. They were symbolic of a nation's fading power, its naval elite, its best aviators, its once feared fleet, all gone. The industrial machine of the United States was just beginning to turn at full speed, and Japan could no longer keep up. 5 minutes, 300 seconds. The time it takes to pour a cup of coffee or walk a city block. That's all it took to alter the balance of power in the Pacific forever. At 10:24 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Japan still had a chance to dictate the outcome of the war. At 10:29 a.m., that chance was gone, consumed by the fires raging across the decks of its once invincible carriers. Those 5 minutes defined the turning point not only of the Pacific War, but of the entire Second World War. They demonstrated that courage must be matched with preparation, that spirit must be supported by strategy, and that even the most powerful empire can collapse in moments when its weaknesses are exposed. Midway was not merely a victory, it was proof that the modern battlefield belonged to those who could think faster, build faster, and learn faster. The story of those 5 minutes reminds us that history often hinges on the smallest decisions. A pilot's choice to keep searching when fuel runs low, a codebreaker's patience over endless messages, a commander's instinct to wait instead of chase. Sometimes 5 minutes can shape the fate of nations. Sometimes they can change the world.